It was an ordinary October day in 1978, and a utility worker named Steve was laying cable on a remote highway in Lyon County, Iowa. Just a short distance off the road, he spotted what he thought was a mannequin. But as he got closer, he soon realized that he had come across something far worse. It was the partially clothed body of a dead woman, and it appeared she had been there for a while. Early articles on the case have investigators laying out their game plan. First, they'd identify who this person is, and then they'd work through her social network of family, friends, and acquaintances to try to piece together her last known movements and what happened to her. But it would not play out as they expected because it would take 27 years for this woman to get her name back. Wilma June Nissen. Identifying her would open the pages to Wilma's story. Chapters upon chapters of more tragedy and hardship than most people face in a whole long life. But Wilma experienced it all before she ended up in that ditch at just 23 years old. There are pages still missing from her book, and her daughter is now trying to find them, to learn her mother's full story, and to fight for justice for a woman she never got the chance to know. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Wilma June Nissen. Rock Rapids, Iowa is one of those blink and you're already through it towns when you're driving. It's actually technically a city, and it's the seat of Lyon County, but it only has around 2,500 people living there. If you drive up I-75 north for 6 miles, you'll hit Minnesota, and if you drive 20 miles west, you're in South Dakota. And most of your driving will be down farm-lined roads mile after mile after mile. One such area is the 9-mile stretch of road called Iowa Highway 182. It connects U.S. Highway 18 to Iowa 9 Southeast. And for weeks, people drove along a stretch near 180th Street with no idea that just off the road in a ditch was the body of a young woman. If you've ever been to a farm community, there are the more well-traveled roads surrounded by fields, a road like Highway 182. And then off of them are what are referred to as farm roads or minimum maintenance roads. And more often than not, that translates to dirt roads. That was the case of the side road a utility worker was making his way down to lay cable off of Highway 182 on October 4th, 1978. As he was walking, the 19-year-old man spotted something that he thought was a mannequin. If you followed a lot of true crime cases over the years, you'll recognize that perception. It's quite common for people who stumble into a body to first think it's a mannequin, because even though it's statistically very unlikely that you'll encounter an old retail mannequin that has just been discarded out in nature, our brains just can't comprehend that we would stumble into a dead body. Once Steve took a moment to get closer and to orient himself to the situation, he realized he had stumbled upon a body, and he quickly ran off to get in touch with authorities. Investigators soon arrived on the disturbing scene. The woman's body was badly decomposed, so right away detectives knew she must have been there a while. Her entire lower jaw was missing, and just a couple of teeth remained intact in her skull. The victim was nude from the waist up. She was wearing a pair of green khaki pants with braid trim around the pockets and waist. She had bikini-style underwear and white patent leather calf-length boots, often called go-go boots and popular at the time. Wrapped around the boots was a piece of hemp rope. How it's been described is that the pants and underwear were wrapped around one of her legs. She was face down, and she also had a silver friendship ring with a gold indentation on her right finger. The positioning of the underwear and pants led investigators to wonder if this had been a sexually motivated crime and if she had been sexually assaulted before her death. The decomposition made this crime scene difficult. Not only was she found in a rural area, the high browning weeds that surrounded her body obscured her from view and delayed her discovery. While her body was sent for an autopsy, the news of her discovery was released to the public in hopes of someone coming forward to identify her. Lyon County investigators were assisted in the investigation by the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Many people in the surrounding states reached out, hoping to confirm that the person found was not their missing loved one. And each time, it wasn't. The autopsy was limited in what was found, but it did have some important findings. Based on the injuries she had, it was believed that the rope tied around her ankles was used to drag her to the location her body was found in, from someplace nearby or from a nearby vehicle. She had a depressed skull fracture 2 inches above her left eye, and they were not able to determine if that contributed to or was related to her death at the time. Her right elbow had been dislocated as well as her cervical vertebrae, an injury that could have occurred after her death, but also the dislocated elbow could signify that she fought back really hard against whoever was attacking her. Her body was tested for the presence of blood or semen, but the state crime lab did not detect the presence of either. That, of course, doesn't mean there wasn't any ever. She just had been out in the elements for a while. And speaking of that, it was determined that she had been out there at least a month, possibly even 2 to 3. The Jane Doe's fingernails were collected as evidence and stored alongside the limited other physical evidence that was obtained. Her fingerprints were also collected to see if they could match the victim to anybody who was missing in the area or anybody they could find in their systems. Now, in the 1980s, technology began to develop in a way where law enforcement could compare fingerprints in a more digitalized way, but it was still very new and it was mostly within individualized states. The demand for this type of technology grew, and into the 90s, there became more nationwide databases for fingerprint comparison, with the eventual nationwide implementation of the APHIS database in the summer of 1999. But back in the late 70s, this just wasn't an option. It was a very manual and imperfect process, so identifying John and Jane Doe's under these circumstances was extraordinarily difficult. The Lyon County Sheriff's Office continued to appeal to the public for information. They described the woman they found as between 20 to 30 years old, about 5 feet 5 inches tall, and around 100 pounds, with dark blonde hair. But the more they struggled to find someone who fit her description missing in their area, the more they began to truly believe she wasn't from around Lyon County, Iowa. Gerald Shanahan, who was chief of the Division of Criminal Investigation, said at the time to the Sioux City Journal, quote, "It's an extremely difficult case. It's going to be hard to get identification. Her hands were very nearly mummified. We've searched all our files on missing persons, and we are going through them again. We had one come in yesterday where the girl has been missing for 2 months, but she didn't fit the description," end quote. Still, he did share that it was rare in their area at least to truly not identify someone, and he was confident that soon they would have their answers. But they wouldn't. The detectives working the case would soon learn it would take much longer than any of them could have ever predicted. Blythe Blumendahl was a detective with the Lyon County Sheriff's Department when the Jane Doe's file landed on his desk in 1985, 7 years after her body was found. The Jane Doe was buried at the Riverview Cemetery in Rock Rapids. File number 7806487. Jane Doe, with a modest grave marker that simply read, "Unidentified female." He later told the Sioux City Journal how overwhelmed he was when he first looked at the task at hand. In fact, he described the investigation process as one similar to restoring a run-down, beat-up house. He said, quote, "When you walk in, you're overwhelmed because you've got 2 years' worth of construction to do to bring this thing up. Where do you start? You start at the beginning." And that's just what he did. Back to trying to figure out who this young woman was. This person who was discarded on the side of the road. Somebody snuffed out her life without care. But Blythe Bloemendahl cared, and no matter what, he wanted to get to the bottom of this. At that point, no comparisons had been found between her fingerprints and any other record that would lead to her identity. So he started going through any missing persons cases he could get his hands on to see if the physical description of the missing person fit this Jane Doe at all. Each time he would run down a potential lead, it wouldn't pan out. Without the identity of who this person was, it was nearly impossible to build out an investigation, but he kept trying any way he could. But years and years would pass without any answers. In 2001, Blythe Bloemendahl became the sheriff of Lyon County, and he carefully handed the case off to Detective Jerry Berkey. He shared what he knew, along with his passion behind finding out the ID of this Jane Doe and using it to find her killer. Berkey carried the torch with the matched enthusiasm to Bloemendahl, and in the early 2000s, he had a few more avenues he could pursue. 1999 was a big year for crime-solving advancements because not only was APHIS established, also the Doe Network was. The Doe Network started out just as a resource website in 1999, but by 2001 it had exploded and turned into a full-on nonprofit organization made up mostly of volunteers who partner with law enforcement to connect missing persons cases with John and Jane Does. The Doe Network volunteers had helped Detective Berkey come up with a list of missing persons who potentially fit his Jane Doe description. So he began contacting any relative he could find of these missing women to see if they could be a match. This, of course, would be fruitless in the end because, as you'll find out, the woman who was found in that ditch was never reported missing. With Detective Berkey running into dead ends again, Bloemendahl requested that the fingerprints of the Jane Doe be analyzed again for potential matches at the state crime lab. And that is when the case broke wide open. I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning into this week's episode. I have so many goals for the podcast this year and getting more exposure to older unsolved cases. And most of those goals require this podcast to reach a broader audience, which is happening every day thanks to listeners like you sharing reviews, telling your friends to check it out, commenting and interacting with the podcast on different platforms, as well as on social media. I do some special mini episodes on TikTok, and each week I share photos that go along with the episode on the Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. I'm also taking case suggestions, and that link can be found in the show notes. Now, back to the show. On January 31st, 2006, a forensic technician in Des Moines, Iowa, found a match between the Jane Doe's left thumbprint and a police booking print card from the Los Angeles Police Department in 1973. This person had been arrested for prostitution. The lab contacted Sheriff Bloemendahl and Detective Berkey with the news, and they could hardly believe it. Their Jane Doe, who the department had spent 27 years trying to give back her name, finally had it. Wilma June Nissen. Chillingly, Nissen's booking photo and information had known aliases, one of which was her street name, Boots. This was emotional and affirming for those working on the case, remembering so vividly the photos of the victim lying face down in the field in her knee-high go-go boots. Now that they had her identity, they had to start the true investigation, one that had been stagnant for all these years. but Bloemendahl and Berkey were ready. In fact, Bloemendahl had a message to the killer or the killers right out the gate. He said, quote, "If I were you, I'd call me before I call you. We're still coming, and if I find you, good luck." After releasing her name to the media, they hoped family would come forward, but in the meantime, they began to try to piece Wilma's life together. But before they got too far, they got an interesting phone call.
I called the Lyon County Sheriff's Department and said, "Hey, I just found out that you found a identity of a body, and her name was Wilma June Nissen." They're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "I'm her daughter."
The voice you just heard there was a woman named Chrissy Atkinson. Chrissy has a complex story of her own. I met with her for an interview recently, and right off the bat, I could tell so many great things about her. She's extremely kind. She actually accommodated me gracefully when I mixed up our time zones for our interview. She is artsy, covered with tattoos and colorful hair, and she sells what she makes across the country at different art shows and run fairs. Her cute dogs and cats joined us for the interview, which all throughout she had a great sense of humor, even as we discussed difficult subject matter. And she happens to be Wilma June Nissen's daughter. Chrissy reached out to me to share Wilma's story and to ask that I feature her case on the podcast. With just the one email, I knew I had to dig in, and Chrissy graciously offered to meet with me to share her voice in telling her mother's story as well. So you'll hear from her in bits and pieces from this point on in the episode. To tell Wilma's story, I've compiled a mixture of news articles, law enforcement investigation information, and utilized Chrissy in everything she has found out in the nearly 20 years of trying to find answers about her mother's case. So to know Wilma, you have to start at the beginning. Wilma June Nissen was born on October 19th, 1954. After her was the birth of her little sister Mona, who had some developmental disabilities. She was also deaf and had difficulty communicating and didn't speak verbally. Wilma and Mona were severely neglected by their parents. When Wilma was just 8 years old, her mother ran off and abandoned the family, leaving Wilma and Mona with their father. Their circumstances only got worse from there. He kept the girls out of school and locked them in the closet when he would go to work for the day. Then, Wilma's father lost his job and the family lost their home, forcing the three of them to live out of his car. During the day, Wilma's father would force her to walk the streets as an 8-year-old child, begging for food for the family, while he kept Mona locked in the trunk.
Horrendous. Like, I can't imagine. I mean, for someone to be homeless before they're 10 years old.
It's unclear exactly how this was discovered, but state authorities did become aware of this abuse in 1964, and Mona and Wilma were removed from his care and placed into the foster care system. By this time, Wilma was 10 years old and didn't know how to read, write, or even use a fork. She had never been a part of the school system. She had never lived a normal life as part of society. Her first foster family was a loving couple named Maxine and Marshall. They enrolled Wilma in school, and though she had missed out on so many elementary school grades already, she worked hard to catch up and was a fast learner. Unfortunately, Maxine developed a debilitating medical condition that made it impossible for her and Marshall to continue to care for Wilma and the other couple of children they had taken in, so she was back in the foster system. This was a heartbreaking decision for the couple. They truly loved Wilma. Wilma bounced around at least a couple of other times to other foster families before landing with the Haas family of Seal Beach, California. The Haas's were a Catholic couple who took in a lot of foster children over the years. While this was the final foster family that Wilma landed with, the records of her time with them are inconsistent. It's safe to say that she was in and out of congregate care settings for youth as she rebelled at times and would be in and out of the Haas residence. Chrissy described the Haas couple to me as rather strict and not very warm and nurturing. She would know because they largely raised her. but we'll get back to that in a minute. Wilma ended up dropping out of school and searching for where to go with her life as she crossed the threshold into adulthood, trying to leave the trauma of her horrific childhood behind. But it doesn't quite work like that, and the trauma would follow her. Over the years, medical professionals and scientists have studied behavior and outcomes based on the ACE questionnaire, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire. It's a tool to measure the impact of childhood trauma on a person's health and well-being. It can also be used to discern risk for certain chronic health conditions and mental illness. ACE scores range from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most profound impacts. There are tons of studies on the impacts of higher ACE scores, one of which is that there are statistically significant associations observed between ACEs and multiple sexual risk-taking behaviors and non-consensual sexual experiences, and those with a history of abuse, neglect, or an ACE score of 3 or more saw particularly more increased odds in this area. Given everything we know about Wilma's childhood, it shouldn't be a surprise that she turned to sex work to make a living and was involved in a series of exploitative relationships. Do we know the dynamics of every single one? No. We do know she was married at least a couple of times, maybe even 3 officially, and it's believed that at least one of these men whom she was married to or in a relationship with also served as her pimp. Sheriff Blumendahl shared his thoughts on this in a 2006 article with the Sioux City Journal when he said, quote, "You can't label her a prostitute in today's time frame because in the 1970s, there's not a lot of aid that you can sign up for. This girl's on the street. She has plenty of disabilities because of the way she was raised by her parents. What chance did she have from that day forward? Very little," end quote. I agree with Blumendahl's sentiment there and would argue that even today, even with more resources than the 70s, there are so many complex reasons why people end up involved with sex work, and we have so much more to do as a society still to ensure that there are options out there for people. True community and societal care, and structures and care systems that set people up for success. On May 10th, 1974, Wilma gave birth to a baby named Michael. After his birth, she and her partner left California heading to Florida. This child was allegedly taken away while she was en route to Florida and placed in the custody of social services. She then gave birth again on December 12, 1974, to another little boy named Donald. If you're counting on your fingers and about to run to my comments section to tell me that my math doesn't math, I understand, but in this case it does. Wilma had become pregnant almost immediately after giving birth to Michael, and then had a premature baby in December. Donald was also taken away and placed into state custody. Wilma was arrested for sex work several times in California, including the time that would ultimately lead to her identity years down the road. In June of 1977, Wilma married a man named Robert. Her arrest for prostitution in California stopped at that time. Wilma was pregnant at the time she got married, with the person who I introduced a little earlier in this episode, Chrissy.
Saw their wedding picture or whatever it was. It definitely wasn't a fancy wedding. And I'm in it. I'm just a bulge in Wilma's belly.
On August 18th, 1977, Crystal Joy was born, premature, weighing in at just 2 pounds, and her outcome was not looking good.
I wasn't supposed to live. I was 2 pounds when I was born. Yeah, I was 2 pounds. I was told I was more, wires and tubes than baby, and I was not supposed to survive.
We're, of course, so glad she did, and I'll share more of Chrissy's story and how she learned about her mother a bit later. But to finish up the known timeline of Wilma, what we know is that shortly after Chrissy's birth, she left the state of California. According to Blumendahl's investigation, it's believed that Wilma left the state with a man named Charles. Charles reported that he was asked by another prostitute to bring Wilma with him to Atlanta because someone in California wanted to hurt her. Chrissy isn't sure if this is the case or not. She said that it's possible Wilma was living a high-risk lifestyle. But she could also see Wilma just taking off on a whim because that's what she's learned of her, that she was kind of a free spirit in her disposition. It's something that Chrissy can relate to, in a way she sees her mom and herself.
I also see her just taking off to take off. Like, hey, let's see what, because I take after her.
Whatever the case, Charles reported that Wilma stayed with him at his mother's house for a short time in 1978 before taking off, and that after that, he never saw her again. Blomendahl and Berkey's investigation led them to find out that at some point after that, but not too long given the timeline of her death, Wilma ended up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, working for an escort service commonly known as the Playmates or the Playgirls. This is a fateful page in Wilma's story because all signs point to this paving the path to her demise. Chrissy grew up not knowing much of her own beginnings. She was raised by the Haasses, the same couple who was the final foster parents of Wilma. They were older by the time they took in Chrissy, the same age as some of the grandparents of the children Chrissy would grow up alongside. A condition of her adoption was that she be told she was adopted, but over the years, her adoptive parents refused to give her any more information on her birth parents. She was always looking, but really ramped up her search in her formative years. Chrissy is very open with her struggles and gave permission to share these parts transparently. She rebelled against her strict upbringing and looked for love and nurturing since she wasn't getting it in the way she needed in the house she grew up. As a teen, she ended up in group homes, and as she entered into adulthood, she found herself battling substance abuse disorder and a period of homelessness, which sent her down a path just like she'd later find out about her mother, in need of money to get by and doing what she needed to do to survive. In her 20s, the mother of a friend of hers began trying to help her find information about her family after Chrissy had found one picture and scant information in the Haas household. And with some perseverance, she found Chrissy's father, Robert. She did go to meet with him, but to her disappointment, he could tell her very little about her mother that she longed to know, a mother whom she was told just walked out on her.
I was always told that it was prearranged. I was an accident, which I probably was. I mean, but I was always told that it was arranged and she just walked out of the hospital and left me.
This is a point that over the years, Chrissy has found she doesn't believe she's been told the full truth about, and she does not think those are the exact circumstances. At this point, Chrissy knew her mom's name because of some of the paperwork she had found and because she had found her father and talked to him, but she couldn't get any information out of her adoptive parents no matter how much she tried, and she just couldn't find her mother. So life carried on. That was until 2006 when that same friend's mom was going through news articles and a name stood out. She drove over to Chrissy's house and asked her for the name of her birth mother, and it was then that she broke the news to Chrissy that Wilma had been identified as a Jane Doe in rural Lyon County, Iowa. Jane Doe, 1978. It was so much to process for Chrissy. Her mother may have initially walked away from the stressors of her life, feeling ill-prepared to care for a premature infant, but she never had the choice in being a part of her daughter's life after that. She was dead around her daughter's first birthday. And the discussion around that choice is important because according to Chrissy, it was unlike Wilma to disappear and drop completely out of contact, which is just another way that Wilma and Chrissy were alike.
It may be 6 months, it may be 3 years. I always came back home, and she did the same. She stayed in contact with her first foster family. They just said that she walked out of the hospital and never came back. They never reported her missing. No one ever reported her missing.
So yes, despite her uncharacteristically not returning to California, nobody ever reported her missing. Upon finding out that her birth mother had died when she was an infant, Chrissy contacted the Lyons County Sheriff's Department to identify herself as Wilma's daughter.
So they had me go down to the police station, take a DNA test. I did. I was. And that's how that went.
Chrissy discussed how much Sheriff Bloemendahl and Detective Berkey cared for her mother's case. They were relentless in their investigation and kept her in the loop every step of the way. In the spring of 2006, a memorial service was held and Wilma was given a proper burial and headstone. She was honored by investigators who had worked tirelessly on her case for decades. In attendance also was her original foster parents, Maxine and Marshall, who were heartbroken to know what happened. One person who couldn't quite bring herself to be there yet was Chrissy. She was struggling so much at that time, and this newfound information released a whole new wave of grief. Both time, Chrissy worked so hard on her life. She got clean and got back on her feet again, and she became the one-man woman pushing forward for answers in her mother's case. One driving factor for her was the mission to just speak up for her mother and solve the case after all of these years. After all, she really felt that she was the only voice her mother had left, advocating for her here on this earth.
The first time someone told me that it's great how hard I'm advocating for her, and I'm like, advocating? What? I was once blonde, naturally. But I'm like, I'm not advocating. I'm the only person left, and she was horrifically murdered, and she never caught a break.
The Lyon County Sheriff's Department wanted to leverage advancements in DNA and see what they could do forensically with the case. With the next of kin permission granted by Chrissy, Wilma's body was exhumed in the fall of 2007 for further testing. But they would run into a huge hurdle. You see, she had been buried in an inexpensive setup at the time. There was a cloth coffin which was over a metal coffin, which took a considerable amount of time to pry open. Once they did, there was a body bag inside, but unfortunately, over the years, the casket had leaked and the body bag was filled with over 40 gallons of water. Investigators were crushed. Bloemendahl said to Dolly Butts at the Sioux City Journal, quote, "We will still be able to find microscopic knife nicks, bone nicks. We'll give it our best shot. We'll come out of this with a cause of death," end quote. But he also added, quote, "DNA is just completely blown because of the water. We're going to take samples of the water and we're going to give them to a pathologist to go microscope them. I'm not saying that we've got a prayer in heaven, but we're going to try," end quote. He also said that they would be siphoning out all the water to make sure no evidence was lost. The exhumation did lead to a determination in the cause of death, but investigators will not release this information, even to Chrissy, because they've said that this is a key piece of information they can withhold to vet out suspects' credibility. It's a piece of information that only law enforcement and those responsible for the murder know. Over the years, after identifying Wilma and tracing her life path in her short 23 years, detectives considered several possible leads, one of which was a serial killer named Robert Rhodes, also known as the truck stop killer. He lived nearby in 1978, but investigators were later able to rule him out after interviewing him in prison. In fact, all leads kept pointing back in one direction: the escort service out of South Dakota. A man named Ross was behind the Playgirls escort service, and the business wasn't exactly a secret. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, you could drive down the highway and see the sign for them. It read, "Playgirls, out call escort service, dating service, home dancing parties, 10 a.m. to 2 a.m., and then it listed a phone number. There are articles with the owner in the paper where he discusses that it's just dancing. There's no solicitation, no prostitution, just a good time. He knew not to serve alcohol or do anything he felt was going to get him shut down. He even briefly expanded the business model into what he referred to as a health club, and I'll just say he and I have very different definitions of that term, but his was one where people could sit in a hot tub and watch women dance. Despite this all being on the fringes of legality, the owner and the municipalities of the greater Sioux Falls area butted heads about this business. Eventually, Ross sold it in 1983. Investigators found through interviews that Wilma was a part of this, and that these home dancing parties would be not far from the Lyon County area where she was found. Remember, she was just over the Iowa and South Dakota border. Despite police never being able to publicly confirm, they secretly suspected that there was sex work and illegal activity tied to this business. Though again, that was always off the record and they could never prove it. So just use this as my disclaimer. Allegedly, allegedly, allegedly. In 2009, a man was arrested for perjury in the case related to lying to investigators about transporting strippers and prostitutes from Sioux Falls to his Northwest Iowa home. According to Detective Berkey, he initially discussed those house parties, then he'd go back on what he said, and it was a whole back and forth. He was very elderly at the time, and those charges were later dismissed, and he's not considered a suspect in the murder. In 2016, police took a big step. They released a photo to the media of a woman who went by the name Sugar. Sugar was alleged to have worked in the escort service with Wilma, and they outwardly name her as a suspect in the case. They shared that they didn't believe Sugar acted alone in this. The police know Sugar's real identity outside of her nickname, but they've not released that to the public. Just her picture, which will be on her Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. The photo is from the late 1970s. They have interviewed her and say that she denies involvement, though they aren't so sure. They also named another person who went by the name Peaches. They do not have a photo of Peaches, and they don't know her true identity. They know that she is a light-skinned black woman out of Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. Police are still seeking clues to her identity. They say that both Sugar and Peaches were engaged in sex work and escort services out of Sioux Falls at the time that Wilma was murdered, and that they were both violent.
They were known
Wilma.
to rob their customers and other girls. Now, they weren't known to kill them, but they were known to do it, and they'd done it multiple times. And I could see maybe Wilma just decided to fight back and fought back too hard and ended up dead.
As they waited for leads around those suspects, they continued to work on DNA advancements. Detectives tried to do what they could with what they had, but as of this very moment, technology just hasn't caught up. They hired a Scandinavian company to do an advanced technique called amplified DNA testing. According to a 2021 interview with Detective Berkey, he said, quote, "We hired them to go through our evidence, the rope, her clothing, and try to come up with as much DNA as they could. And they could find DNA, but they had to amplify it." DNA amplification is the production of multiple copies of a sequence of DNA. The problem is, this technique is not currently compatible with CODIS. So for now, everything is wait and see. Eventually, the detectives who Chrissy got so close with, who she felt were truly committed to solving her mother's case, they have retired, and since then, the new contacts in the sheriff's department will no longer discuss the case with her. Where there had previously been an abundance of information, including a tip line and a $10,000 reward, this has all been taken down by the sheriff's department, and Chrissy has no idea why.
I've looked on the website. All the links are broken.
Yeah.
It's absurd. It's insane.
Chrissy says what haunts her the most at this moment is not knowing the cause of death because it leaves her with her own dark thoughts and all the possibilities. All she has been told is that she died a brutal and horrific death.
I'm not asking for, I would love to know the cause of death so I can stop losing my mind thinking she was like dragged behind a car or something. All I hear is how horrific and brutal it was. And I want to know, but I understand that I can't know. But I just want them to remain in contact with me.
At this point, Chrissy hopes with all her strength that the sheriff's office will come through and solve this case. For now, she is trapped in this unique space of grief where she mourns this person she never got to know and never got to grow up with, and everything they may have missed out on.
I do. I feel like a piece of me is missing. because I think her and I, we either would have been best friends or we would clash like nobody's business because we have so many things in common.
To wrap up this episode, I want to share a few calls to action. There isn't just one takeaway that Chrissy wants you to have. She hopes to solve her mother's case, but she has a few other asks as well. Number 1, please utilize the email she created for her mother's case. She's the only one that monitors this, and she wants it for multiple uses. Not just for tips, but anybody who knew her mother in any capacity. Just please reach out to her.
That Justice for Wilma at AOL, that's me. And I would like to talk to anyone that knew her. I don't care if they knew her as a prostitute. I don't care if they were friends. I don't care who they were. If they knew her, I want to know all I can because I feel like a piece of me is missing.
So I'm not sure if you caught the email address there, but I will have it in the show notes. But it is Justice, Justice, number 4, so Justice for Wilma at AOL.com. Ask number 2 is that, of course, if you have tips in her mother's case, please contact the Lyon County Sheriff's Office at 712-472-8300 or the Cold Case Coalition tip line at 385-258-3313. There is also a website called WeTip.com, which is a tip line where you can report tips from anywhere. Chrissy wants to stress that at this point, she's not looking for trouble. If you engaged in sex work or you were hosting these parties or attending or selling drugs or something like that back then, she just wants answers. Number 3, if you are a forensic expert in any capacity or have connections to one, she wants to learn more about amplified DNA and if there's anything that is coming that could help utilize amplified DNA to get answers. She is looking for any advancements that can be done that she can discuss with the sheriff's office. Number 4, she is looking for people to come forward about Peaches and Sugar. Peaches has never been identified. Even though Sugar has, police need people to come forward and speak to what they know, to corroborate stories, and to help move the case forward. Finally, Chrissy has been spending time trying to reconnect with relatives who she has never met. Just this week, she identified the adopted name of one of her brothers she is hoping to connect with. If you know anybody by the name of Michael L. Hart, H-A-R-T, born in 1974, or if that's you and you're listening, please reach out to Chrissy at the Justice for Wilma at AOL.com. Chrissy also keeps an active Reddit page, and she is available on Instagram. To end this, I want to share a final thought from Chrissy.
My mom's case is it's so close. I can feel it. It's so close. They just need a tiny something to catch whoever did it. And if they're dead, they're dead. I need answers.
If you have any information on the murder of Wilma June Nissen, please reach out via the resources I shared, which will also be in the show notes. Wilma was someone who lived a difficult life that was brutally cut short far too soon. She deserved better than the hand she was dealt, and so does Chrissy. While nothing can bring Wilma back, the answers in what happened to her mother can finally give her some sense of closure and create space for Chrissy to heal these open wounds. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please get the word out and leave a 5-star review. Follow along each week, and I welcome comments and engage regularly with listeners on the cases I cover, so get in touch. As always, thank you so much for listening.